Welcome to Shootin' Straight. I'm your host, Ken Buck. In today's highly partisan environment, political adversaries often minimize each other's arguments by labeling motives rather than engaging in constructive dialogue. For the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you to join me as we learn about David Satter and how he became a leading expert on the Soviet Union. We will learn about David's background growing up in Chicago, then becoming a Rhodes Scholar, and his work as the Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times. It is my pleasure to welcome David Satter to the show. Are you ready to start shooting straight?
Absolutely.
So you've written 5 books. You're working on your 6th book about the Soviet Union and Russia. And one of my favorite titles for a book is your book. It was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway. How did you develop this interest in the Soviet Union?
Well, the interest in the Soviet Union goes back to my childhood. The title is taken from a Russian proverb.
Okay.
I can't claim to be original. I've rated Russian proverbs for most of my titles. But in any case, I grew up in Chicago, and I studied Russian because I went to a high school near the University of Chicago, which amazingly enough offered Russian as a possible language. But also my family were what were then called progressives, insofar as they had sympathy for the Soviet Union. They thought it was an idealistic country, that maybe the communists had gone a bit too far, but basically their hearts were in the right place.
Tell me the time frame.
We're talking about the 1950s, 1950s,
Okay.
Then early 1960s.
What did your father do for a living?
He was a lawyer in Chicago. He defended, in fact, he had a lot of African-American clients, and he defended them against financial exploitation, exploitation in the credit market, in the housing market. He became well known for that in Chicago. But his view of the world was a view that was very sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and I grew up with those sympathies. The situation changed in 1962 in a fundamental way when, or was it 1961? I'm not sure. It was the 22nd Party Congress when Khrushchev himself said that millions of people had been killed. And when
he said millions of people have been killed in the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union. My father had always assumed that that was propaganda. But when the head of the Soviet Union himself said publicly that there had been mass murder in the Soviet Union, he was completely shocked.
And did that cause him to rethink his sympathies?
Yes. Unfortunately, he died only a few years later. But he was in the process of reevaluating everything.
And how did that influence your thinking?
Well, of course, I also wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know where does the truth lie? And after my father died in 1965, one of his colleagues said to me, "You're starting out where your father ended, not where he began."
What does that mean?
It meant that I had already understood the evil that existed in the world, that reality is complex, that the truth is sometimes difficult to find, that propaganda is sometimes extremely effective in hiding reality. And also there is such a thing as mass psychology, which blinds people to the truth.
You say that the propaganda hid reality. It also created a false reality at the same time.
Well, it did both. The point of if we're talking about Soviet communist propaganda, it had 2 purposes. One was to shield the Soviet Union from the truth. In other words, to stamp out any truthful information. And the other was to substitute for truthful information a completely fictitious version of reality, which it would then foist on people. And this effort was actually quite effective under conditions of a totalitarian police state. People asked, well, where are the witnesses to the atrocities? they didn't understand that all the witnesses could be destroyed, or that people could be so intimidated that they would say exactly the opposite of the truth if they were questioned by foreigners. We didn't have experience of that kind of regime, that kind of behavior. And as a result, we were slow to grasp what was happening. Some of the greatest thinkers and writers of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, they were either sympathetic to communism or infatuated with it until they found out the truth.
And you're speaking now of Western writers.
Western writers and people in the Soviet Union as well.
Okay.
Because the reality of what was going on inside the Soviet Union was a carefully guarded secret. They didn't shoot people in public. Cubans did that later, but they did that in order to terrorize. In the Soviet Union, people just disappeared, and you dared not ask what happened to them.
So I want to back up a little bit before we move forward, because now
Sure.
you're talking a lot about personal experience and stories that have been related to you by people who lived during that time frame. And I want to back up a little bit. You graduate from the University of Chicago,
Yes.
and then you go on a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. Tell us about that experience.
Well, I went to Oxford again because of a family situation. My father, in his work on behalf of kind of economic justice for the African American community in Chicago, also began to experience some of the complexities of the situation when he himself was wiped out financially as a result of neighborhood change. In Chicago, there was rigid segregation. Blacks and whites didn't live in one neighborhood. Blacks moved in, whites moved out. The neighborhoods changed. I wrote about this in an article for the University of Chicago newspaper that then was published in the New Republic and was noticed by Joseph Alsop, who was at the time the leading political columnist in the United States, and he recommended me for a Rhodes Scholarship. Once I got to Oxford, I decided I didn't want to deal any longer with race. I had said what I had to say, and I wanted to look beyond the United States, beyond our internal conflicts, try to understand the world as a whole. And the conflict in the world as a whole was the conflict between communism and the free world. And the center of that conflict was Moscow. And I was living in Oxford, and I was in a position to go to Moscow. And so I studied the Russian language. I went there. After a brief detour, a 4-year detour as a police reporter in Chicago, I went to Moscow in 1976. I was correspondent in Moscow for the London Financial Times at the height of totalitarian rule. And I began to ask people to tell me their stories. I wanted to record their life stories in order to preserve them for the future.
Was this part of your reporting for the Financial Times, or was it more of a personal interest?
My reporting for the Financial Times did not require me to do that. It was, but my intellectual interests did. And also my desire right from the beginning to write a book about what I was seeing, because it was so remarkable.
How were you received in the Soviet Union at the time?
Well, it depends by whom. By the authorities, not very well. By Russians themselves, extremely well, because I paid them the ultimate compliment. I took an interest in their lives. I wasn't superficial, and I was willing to sit and to listen and to take down and to try to understand. Not very many people were willing to do that.
So why? It's always a fascinating subject to me. You're in the middle of a very repressive regime where people disappear, and you decide that you're going to record the very thing that scares this regime the most, that intimidates this regime, that they will react to the most negatively? Why?
Well, by 1976, the era of mass killing in the Soviet Union was over. People were still very much afraid, but there was a little space for liberty, especially in the major cities. And there were some people who didn't give a damn and were ready to take risks. There was a small room for maneuver, for self-expression. And people who had made that decision to try to express themselves, to try to tell the story of what they were experiencing, those were the people who contacted me. I began to meet them. They recommended others, their friends. They advised me about situations that other people didn't know about. And all of this went into my first book, which is called Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union. Tell the story of the country as it really was. But of course, there were risks, and there were people who spoke to me who suffered as a result, and who consciously took a risk. And I warned them that they were taking a risk, and that there could be consequences. But they said that there are going to be consequences either way, and at least this way the world will know, that I existed.
So you lived in the Soviet Union, worked for the Financial Times. You were involved in the radio, the free radio.
Radio Liberty.
Radio Liberty.
Well, this was much later.
Okay.
Much later. I was during the years of the Soviet Union, I was involved with Radio Liberty because my articles were broadcast back to the Soviet Union by Radio Liberty.
Okay. And given this interest, you learned a lot about communism, and tell the listener, what is the view of communism towards private property rights and the individual, and sort of the labor of the individual? In 5 words or less.
All right, this is we'll do our best here. The theory of communism is that a communist system is a system in which the means of production, the economic means of production, are in the hands of the state. There is no private property. Private property is expropriated. And the theory of communism holds that it is private property which is at the root of war, class conflict, and oppression. And all that has to be done to put an end to those things is to abolish private property and collectivize everything. Well, that's the theory. And states that were organized on that basis at one point governed a third of the population of the world. They also, the imposing that system also led to 100 million deaths. Easily.
In what way? You say deaths in famine or
famine, deliberate, but it had to be deliberate famine, mass murder. Those were the principal ways in which people were killed.
And they were killed to bring the population into line with the state philosophy?
Well, the average person doesn't want to be reduced to a unit in a herd. He doesn't want to be collectivized. Private property is one of the ways in which people, assert and protect their individuality and make demands for rights. Eliminate private property, especially when you do it by force and on the basis of a supposed perfect science, is to create the conditions for treating the individual human being as if he were property.
What is the role of religion, or how did the Soviet Union treat religion in those days?
Well, the Lenin took the view that you could not use force to extirpate religion, that if you hammered it down, it would only embed itself deeper. So therefore, they tried to create the conditions for religion to die out on its own. There was massive anti-religious propaganda. They would limit the number of churches. They would control the priests. Many of the priests were people who were recruited by the KGB. They would monitor sermons. They would place religion under their control, under conditions in which religion, they hoped, would discredit itself.
And why was that so important to the philosophy?
Well, simply because religion was a competing philosophy. Marxism is a complete, if you understand Marxism, which of course none of our Marxists in this country do, but that's another matter, is a complete theory of reality. It claims to be a perfect science. It's a theory of reality which eliminates the role of religion. And it eliminates the role of anything that is not materialistic. It's based on the theory, as I learned to my sorrow when I got to Moscow, of dialectical materialism, the idea that everything that is matter, which is constantly turning into its opposite. So it's incapable of generating moral rules. I say my sorrow because as a kid in Chicago, I was absolutely furious at an evangelical preacher who every Sunday morning interfered with the cartoons that I wanted to see by talking about the evils of dialectical materialism. Well, many, many years later, when I went to Moscow and I studied the ideology, I realized that communist ideology was the root of the communist system, and that the root of the ideology was, guess what? Dialectical materialism. And I realized that preacher who I had disliked as a child was 100% right. But I think at that age, it would have been a lot for me to have understood that.
And not nearly as much fun as the cartoons.
No, he had some serious competition there on Sunday morning.
So what is the relationship between communism and socialism in what you observed?
Well, there's the official Soviet definition of socialism is that socialism is the first stage of communism. That a socialist society in which property has been expropriated still has some remnants of capitalist habits, of capitalist institutions or organizations of some sort, and is in the process of becoming a communist society in which all of the promises of the ideology will be fully realized, especially the promise that there would be unlimited prosperity. Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader, promised the Soviet people, we're going to live under communism in 1980. And Soviet people never forgot that promise because we were, when Brezhnev became the leader and people were saying, well, Khrushchev promised we'd be living under communism, Brezhnev said, well, now we're in the stage of developed socialism. And he says, and this stage may go on for quite a while. But what he meant was, what people were saying is, why are we living in poverty? Because communism promises wealth. The designation of socialism in the Soviet Union was in order to persuade people that they're on their way to that promised wealth. But the term socialism is used differently in other parts of the world. I mean, it began to be used by persons who prescribed to Marx's analysis of capitalism, in other words, of its inequality and unfairness, but nonetheless were not revolutionaries and rejected its scientific pretensions. And they called themselves socialists. In Britain, they were the Fabian socialists. There were the socialist measures were instituted, as in Western Europe, or at least measures, social welfare measures were instituted in Western Europe that were then called socialist. In the U.S. today, we have a lot of people using the term socialist. But if we take the classical definition that was used in the Soviet Union and that characterized the governments under which a third of the population of the world lived, then they are not socialist. They are people who are arguing for social welfare, an expanded welfare state, and social democracy, but they are not based. But even in their most extreme form, they're not talking about the forcible abolition of all private property, which is what was the basis for the quote-unquote socialist world that existed pretty much until the late 1980s when it began to fall apart.
When you write about the Soviet Union, you talk about an individual as raw material, and not in a very flattering way. That the individual is no more than raw material.
Absolutely no more than raw material, because Marxism denied the existence of a transcendent source of authority, of a higher power. Marxism was the Soviet Union was the first country in the world to be based exclusively on atheism, explicitly on atheism. And Marxism denies the existence of a soul. I mean, how can there be a soul if there's no transcendent source of authority, and everything that exists is based on matter?
So at some point, the Soviet Union,
under those circumstances, the human being is an input of production, just like metal, timber, water, people.
Right. At some point, the Soviet Union falls apart, is broken up, but the concept exists in Russia and other countries. How did that happen? What was the transition between the Soviet Union and where Russia is now?
Well, what Russia needed was the rule of law. What they needed, what they talked about the difference between class values and universal values. When we say class values, the consequences of Marxism for moral values were that whatever fosters, and this was made explicit by Lenin in his speech to the Komsomol in 1919, he said, whatever facilitates the revolution is moral. Whatever gets in the way is immoral. The revolution represents the interests of the working class. The working class is the historically most progressive class. So therefore, the interests there's no universal standard of right and wrong, which is equally applicable to everyone. There's only the interests of the working class. And if it's in the interest of the working class to murder hundreds of thousands of people, well, that's moral, because it advances the revolution. The same, then the Nazis merely picked up the same. Once that breakthrough had been made, it was a very simple matter for the Nazis to adopt the same psychology but apply it to race, that the master race was the measure of right and wrong. Anything that got in the way of the master race had to be destroyed, crushed, gassed, exterminated. After the Soviet Union fell, the important thing was to reject completely this point of view and establish, on the contrary, a set of universal standards in Russia that would apply equally to everyone. And that was never done, because the emphasis was completely on the transformation of the economic system. So
from a communist system to a
capitalist system, but without the rule of law. So all you did was you got rid of communism and you introduced criminality.
And that's where Russia is today.
That's where Russia is today. And the so-called reformers assumed that everything depends on the economy, just the same way the communists did. But they took the view that, well, everything will depend on the communists put property in the hands of the state. We'll take it out of the hands of the state. That'll solve all problems. But they didn't care who received the property. And if it went to criminals, that was fine.
America and Western countries participated in that transformation, and that
we encouraged it, but the Russians think we did it maliciously, that we wanted to destroy Russia. That's not true. We did it. I have a lot of firsthand experiences. We did it out of ignorance. There's a very low level of expertise regarding Russia in the U.S., including in those circles who make our policy, and a lot of self-confidence that's not justified. And American policy in those years was based on cliches and superficial view of the society. And basically, we treated Yeltsin, who was himself a criminal, as someone who was the great champion of democracy, which he never was. And as a result, in the eyes of the Russian people, we were identified with the criminalization of the country, and democracy lost its prestige and attractiveness for many Russians, because they became confused. If the United States is saying that this is democracy, when all they see around them is robbery, extortion, and murder, then maybe there's something wrong with democracy.
So we have been influenced by Marx, Lenin, Soviet thinkers from early 1900s in this country, in our policies, and we see more and more of that influence. And we talked about where Russia is today.
Well, we weren't in the American policy toward Yeltsin's Russia was not the product of any sympathy for Marxism. It was a product of just homegrown American superficiality. It was not ideological. It was simply the fact that we were not professional.
And I'm thinking more in a broader sense.
But in the country as a whole, in the society, and throughout the West, Marxism, had its influence.
Right, and that's what I'm trying to identify now. Is we've talked a lot about Soviet Union and Russia, and yet we see some of the degradation of human dignity in this country. We see speech being questioned. We see meritocracy being questioned, and free markets. Where are we today, and as it relates to this philosophy?
Well, we have a problem in the U.S. right now with herd psychology, group psychology. The problem is that because we don't, we told ourselves after the Holocaust, never again. Maybe to a lesser degree, but people will tend to agree that the communist atrocities should not be repeated. But the horrors of the 20th century are not studied, they're not understood, and so there's a vacuum really in this country, a dangerous intellectual vacuum. We don't know the true contours of the world. We don't know the true contours of history. As a result, we magnify in importance a lot of the day-to-day conflicts that we have in the political arena here. We argue over medical care. We argue over minimum wage, over tax policy, many things that societies have always argued about, and and where the balance moves back and forth. Depending on the priorities of the country at a given point in time. What we never argue about, and that we never give our attention to, is how the fundamental importance of universal standards and the importance of free expression and free speech and promotion by merit and preparedness against the evil in the world that America as a democratic country may be obliged to face one day. And we won't face those things because we don't understand them as responsibilities on the one hand and challenges on the other. That we indeed are responsible for making sure that our universities teach subjects that are real subjects and not examples of people specializing in their personal neuroses. Or we don't accept responsibility for honesty in the press and in the media. There was just an example of this with the controversy surrounding the increasing evidence that COVID-19 is the product of a lab leak in China. And the Washington Post went back and changed a headline in which they had retrospectively where they had ridiculed Senator Cotton for speaking about this, information, implying a lab leak and saying it was a conspiracy theory. So they're covering up for themselves. But we don't see apologies. For example, the Russia collusion scandal. I had the honor of being maybe the first person in the United States to point out in 2017 that the Steele dossier was obvious Russian disinformation. 2.5 years, the country was obsessed with that, and this was a result of not only incompetent but unethical reporting. So these are when we don't have an awareness of history, and we don't want to have it, we won't have an awareness of the importance of objective standards, of honest standards, of high quality universities, of high quality newspapers, and magazines and other.
You were honored with a Rhodes Scholarship when in your younger years. I won't say when you were young because you're still obviously young now, but in your younger years. What's happened to that scholarship and what's happened to the thinking around institutions like the Rhodes Scholarship?
Well, this is very discouraging for me. I mean, what I'm witnessing with the Rhodes Scholarship is the adoption of a so-called woke mentality and the abandonment of a standard of excellence. And the Rhodes Scholarship was important not just for those who won. The Rhodes Scholarship was important for all of those who tried to compete, and as a result were motivated to do their best. And many of those, maybe they never went to Oxford, but the effort that they made paid dividends, in their respective fields for years afterward.
So what's happened to it? What's going on?
Well, excellence is not important now. Now, I mean, they will claim, of course, that their goal is excellence, but they're being disingenuous. They've established, for example, a dean of students whose specialization is diversity. Diversity is not a bad thing in a multiracial society. And we need to have people from all backgrounds occupying high positions. But we don't need to have it in the Rhodes Scholarship, there have to be some institutions which are excellence alone. Otherwise, then what are you having diversity for? I mean, you're becoming, you're parceling out distinctions that no longer exist. So I have written about this, and I received a tremendous response from other Rhodes Scholars. I'm hopeful that we can do something about this. As matters stand now, the the selection process is not fair, and the criteria are improper. And that has and there's it violates the Rhodes's will. Rhodes said in his will that there should be no discrimination against any group or religion, and no favoritism. But we have a system of the administration of the Rhodes Trust is putting in a system of favoritism.
Any relationship between what you observed in the Soviet Union and what you just referred to as a woke culture or movement in America?
What we have now in the United States is the rise of mass psychology and the rise of ideological thinking. The unwillingness of people. It's not true that, for example, the executives of Coca-Cola or Google or Intel or any of these big corporations have given, or the New York Times, have given deep thought to the future of the country, and have decided that there's a tremendous crisis that justifies rejecting institutions that have proven their worth over hundreds of years. There isn't any deep thought. There's a herd psychology is what there is. And a herd psychology is what a totalitarian regime counts on. The idea that people will not think for themselves, that they will take their cues exclusively from others, that they will be afraid to express themselves. Just try and express yourself on the campus of an major American university if you're a junior faculty member and you don't agree with the prevalent dogma. And to enforce this herd mentality, the Soviet Union made liberal use of informers. Well, we're well on our way to an informer culture in this country, in which anything anyone says at any time can be dredged up, and no amount of apology will save that person, because they're being punished by their corporation, and the corporation itself is not thinking. Who wants to be at the mercy of Coca-Cola for any stray thought? The warden of Rhodes House, in response to an article that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, said that I had revealed my racial biases. Well, first of all, I don't have any racial biases, but that's the Wall Street Journal cut that line. They didn't print it, but it did appear in Oxford publications. That's defamation. Now, I'm not going to do anything about it, although I didn't like it. But it just shows the imbalance. Those who are accused of, let's say, racial insensitivity for some random remark they made when they were a teenager, have their careers ruined. Those people who are spewing out unfounded accusations of racism don't face any penalty at all. Well, that's the way it is in a totalitarian state. There was during the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, the most powerful people were the mentally unbalanced, who began accusing everybody, and those accusations were taken seriously.
So, on a lighter note, I have a fun question.
Well, that's what we need is some. After all this,
that I ask all my guests, and the question is: if loving this is wrong, I don't want to be right. And what is this?
Well, for me, it's intolerance of intellectual dereliction of duty. It reminds me of something that Trotsky said. Trotsky was full of good quotes. Although he was murderous, and I don't want. But I will repeat this. He said of Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, he said, "Everyone has a right to be stupid, but Comrade MacDonald is abusing the privilege." And this is how I feel a lot of the time when I hear a lot of what's going on. If I could, I would summon people, to try to think and read and accept intellectual responsibility if you want to be politically active.
Great. I want to thank David Satter for shooting straight with us, and I want to thank you for listening today. I hope this program has been informative, enlightening, and uniting. As Americans struggle with the difficult issues facing our country, we are reminded that good policy is the result of open, thoughtful discussion. For more straight shooting programs, go to my website, shootinstraightpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed the show and have ideas about future topics or guests, shoot me an email, ken@shootinstraightpodcast.com. God bless you, and remember to always shoot straight.